Hello and welcome to yet another edition of your weekly international current affairs program. Globe Watch from the Cameroon Radio Television with me, Charles Obuni, aired from the Starland Hotel here in Yaoundé, Cameroon. Climate change is one of the greatest crises and challenges facing our world today, and one of the key ways of rolling back the negative effects of climate change across generations and countries is providing the necessary finances to provide an alternative pathway in the way we manage our natural resources and the environment in which we live, in order to produce a blueprint that will tame the climate change effects around the world. My guest today on Globe Watch is the co-chair of one of the world's leading, if not the largest world leading coordinating agency for climate finance, the Green Fund. The co-chair of the Green Climate Fund, Seyni Nafo of Malian nationality. Welcome to Globe Watch.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
You have just been elected in South Korea, where the headquarters of the Green Climate Fund is found. How was your election?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm here to attend the largest young forum on climate finance, on adaptation on the continent. So happy to be here to do that. So the Green Climate Fund elects co-chairs once a year, two co-chairs, one representing all developed countries and one representing all developing countries, meaning more than 146 countries. And I've had the good fortune of being elected for a number of reasons. I've been an advisor to board members for the last 12 years or so. And there's a new cycle starting January 1st. And my colleagues have deemed me fit to serve the board. And at the same time, this is happening in a moment where the Green Climate Fund is going through a restructuring. We've had a new executive director just a year and a half ago, was coming with renewed energy to address a number of challenges, one of which is access, meaning accelerating the access to the Green Climate Fund's resources.
Which means that of the 14 years of existence of the Green Climate Fund, you have spent within that ecosystem roughly 12 years, which means that you know the nitty-gritties of how the structure functions. How critical is the Green Climate Fund in helping the whole global discourse of fighting climate change and global warming?
Well, it is today the largest multilateral climate fund. So the fund was capitalized in 2015, just going to Paris, an initial capitalization of $10 billion, and it has been replenished in 2018, and it was further replenished last year. So that's about 30 plus billion in 10 years. We have approved about $15 billion. And what we also do is that most of our project we co-fund, meaning usually when we fund a project with, let's say, $1 from the Green Climate Fund, we're also able to attract another $1 from another institution. So far, we've pretty much in our portfolio reached about total mobilization target is 30 billion. And we're looking for a $50 billion mark by 2030. So that's significant, but still, unfortunately, the needs, just on this continent, the needs are so much that the GCF needs to really overhaul its strategy. Out of that 15 billion or so, which was approved, the continent received 1/3 of that. So 1/3, so this is about $3 billion every year. I mean, $3 billion roughly every 3 years, 1 billion per year. Africa needs about 20 times that much. 20 times that much. So what we're working on in the Green Climate Fund right now is a strategy where we work with countries in establishing a comprehensive resource mobilization strategy, which has the GCF in the center, but which allows really countries to mobilize all kinds of finance, all kinds of public and private, domestic and international. So this is what role we want to play. We want to have a GCF advising countries.
Resource mobilization is a key element of that fund, and like you said, you have disbursed already roughly $16.1 billion, sponsoring roughly 286 projects across some 160 countries, roughly, something of that nature. The projects you sponsor to roll back climate change, what is their nature?
So there's fundamentally two
green agriculture, forest restoration, land restoration, or what?
All of that. So there's two fundamental types of climate projects. You have those projects which deals with the impact. So they're called adaptation, meaning adaptation to climate change. And there's those who are trying really to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They're called mitigation projects. So out of that you have broad, so those are the two types. And then you have really broad categories. Whether, so if you were to assess African countries' climate strategies, you would see that agriculture and water are the two most important sectors, or the priority sectors. Producing more, ensuring food security in a climate which is more and more variable, which is more and more unstable, which is more and more unpredictable. That's one priority. A second is water, sustainable water management for human, for agriculture.
Some UN reports, including the UN Framework Conference on Climate Change, indicates that for the nationally determined contributions to meet the targets of keeping temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next century, the world needs to invest roughly $6 trillion by 2030 as part of the Sustainable Development Goals. In 2015, at the Paris Climate Change Deal, we globally agreed that those who polluted the world should contribute at least $100 billion annually.
Yes.
You were the presidential envoy for climate for Mali. You have spent so many years in the climate change discussions. Why do you think we are unable to meet the financial targets we set out all the time?
Very easy. And I'm also the spokesperson for the African Group of Negotiators, a role that I've played for the last 15 years. Out of the last, I've also been the chair of the African Group. That question is very easy: lack of political will. Those pledges, the 100 billion, which was originally made in 2009, first of all by
Copenhagen.
Yes, in Copenhagen by Gordon Brown, then
British Prime Minister.
Then British Prime Minister, and then Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State.
The U.S. Secretary of State.
Indeed, 100 billion. So that figure was announced
in the first part of the Obama administration.
Indeed, and this was this was a collective target for all developed countries. They were supposed to meet that target in 2020. I think they met them based on OECD data last year. Again, 100 billion. If you compare 100 billion to everything else, defense budget of developed countries. If you compare it to that figure, if you compare it to stimulus, the different stimulus the West has been able to mobilize for COVID and health, this is a drop. We in the we work in the African Group of Negotiators. There's right now we're going to a COP, right? We're going to a COP in Baku literally in days, where the developed countries with us, we will be setting a new goal, meaning the goal which will replace the 100 billion Africa's position is at least 1.5 to 2 trillions. The reality is that there's no shortage of resources. Economists will tell you that we are right now in a fiat currency system, a global monetary system, which is fiat, meaning that literally governments or central banks print money. And this is what the West has done. The Federal Reserve of the US, the central bank in the EU, the ECB, and the Japanese bank, the Bank of Japan, they have been printing money to stimulate their economies. 2-3 years ago, you had $17,000 billion, so 17 trillion of negative interest rate bonds. Negative interest rate bonds. Any economist, any student in an economic class will tell you this is illogical that you have negative interest rate bonds. So there's no shortage of resources. There is shortage of political will. Because unfortunately, the bulk of the impact and the suffering and pain is happening in developing countries. It's not happening in developed countries. It's not happening in the US. It's not happening in Europe. It's not happening in Japan. It's happening in Africa.
How critical is the situation of climate change in developing countries where you are their spokesperson, you are the voice? How critical is it?
It is, if you look at it, it is a question in many instances of life and death. I'll give you a few examples. So the African Development Bank did a study a few years ago, and in that study, it informs us that climate change is already costing 5% of GDP per year. Most African countries don't grow at 5% GDP. So what does that mean? That means that climate change impacts are eroding development gains. I'll give you, again, concrete examples. The floods. The whole of, look at the map right now, the whole of Central Africa, Northern Africa, part of Northern Africa, the whole of the Sahel right now is flooded. So when you have that, imagine you've built, government borrow to build roads. Then you have a flood, washes away the road. Well, the debt on the government books remains, but the infrastructure is no longer there. The very Durban COP17, where we launched the cycle in 2011, which led to the Paris Agreement, the port of Durban was flooded 2 years ago. Same thing, take Mozambique. Mozambique, when you hear Mozambique, people will tell you this is the next El Dorado in terms of gas reserves.
Sure.
But some of us are extremely anxious when we talk about Mozambique. Why? Because Mozambique is geographically positioned and get now frequently, if not year after year, hit by cyclones, to the point of the president of Mozambique has now been appointed as the natural disaster champion for the African Union. So the reality for a country like Mozambique is that we've done the math within the African group of negotiators. We've sort of tallied the two numbers, meaning Mozambique is producing gas. How much will that generate in the next 10, 15, 20 years? And at the same time, Mozambique is being hit every year by either natural disasters or extreme climate event. How much is that costing? And we're realizing that if we don't deal with climate change in a serious manner, Mozambique will not make enough money from its oil and gas to deal with the impact of climate change. I'll give you another example. Most African countries rely on agriculture. Meaning, if you look at the structure of the economy,
it's an agrarian one.
Yeah, 40% is GDP. 40% is GDP. 40% of the GDP of most African countries is agri. 40%. 60 to 70% of the labor force is in agriculture. Now, a figure, guess how much percent of credit, meaning commercial banking credit, is going to agriculture? Less than 5%. So meaning, and agriculture is in many instances, in most African countries, rain-fed, labor-intensive. So meaning ancient, inadequate, there's not much tech intake, not much nutrient intake, not much sustainable water intake. So this is the most vulnerable from a socio-economic, both a socio perspective, meaning if 60% of your population depend on on a sector which is that exposed. You can only imagine. I think, and look at imports, food imports. I think Africa has reached now $500 billion worth of food imports.
Amongst the target populations of the 286 RAFA projects you have sponsored in the past 14 years, of course, it's the youth that you want to target to see how they can manage the future themselves. How critical, you who has been in discussions, spokesperson, presidential envoy, adaptation, how much do you invest in telling the story of the adverse effect of climate change to young people?
Well, this is so, as you know, I'm running the Africa Adaptation Initiative, which is the initiative African heads of states have launched in Paris to foster and promote concrete implementation on the ground. So we're very happy to work with PACJA, which is the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, which has launched an initiative just on young youth and adaptation finance, led by my very good brother, Dr. Augustin Nyamchi. So what we're doing really is to work with the youth in training the youth to be climate finance experts, to be able to draft projects and programs. So I'll give you a number. I told you at the beginning of this conversation that Africa mobilizes 1/3 of the GCF resources. That's just one part of the reality. Another part of that reality is that 80%, over 80% of those 30% is mobilized by non-African entities. What does that mean? That means that you're not having Africans mobilizing resources by Africans for Africans. I'll give you, we are in Cameroon. This region, Central Africa, the 15 countries or so, from Chad down to Angola, the two Congos, this region is the only region in the world which doesn't have one accredited entity, national accredited entity to the Green Climate Fund. So those are some of the issues that I want to address.
I will be coming to that in a moment. You have been elected recently. Your first trip was to Cameroon.
Yes.
How crucial was you to attend the youth meeting in Yaoundé on climate?
It is fundamental. Why? Because of three reasons. First, I mean, climate change itself for Africa is a triple tragedy. I call it a triple curse. We've not created that problem. Africa is only what, 5%, less than 5% of emission. We are going to be the most affected simply because the continent warms 1.5 times faster than the rest of the world. And even if we wanted to solve the problem, because 95% of emissions outside of this continent, we cannot. So we need to work with the rest of the world. So that's the peculiarity of climate change. But why here? Why Yaoundé? And why the youth? Because to me, when I think youth, there's three values which come to mind: innovation and creativity, excellence, and resilience. We are a young continent. So as a young continent, we should be able to innovate, to be creative, to seek excellence, and really to be resilient. And that's why it was so important for me to have an opportunity to have this conversation with the youth and also tell them the job and prosperity opportunities in climate change. I have, as much as this is your worst to me, the worst challenge and the worst crisis, it's also the job opportunity and prosperity in every part of climate change or the fight against climate change is huge. It's almost unlimited. Climate change is, climate adaptation is local specific. So you just take a country like Cameroon. The north of Cameroon, you are in the Sahel. You are in the Sahel, maybe even in the Sahara for some, and in the south, if you go through the coast, you're going to have different climate impacts. You might have droughts in the north and floods in the south. So that calls for different type of interventions, different type of planning, different type of resources. What does that mean? That means different type of opportunities. And the young, we need to train the young to take advantage of
the Green Climate Fund. The Congo Basin is the world's second largest ecological ecosystem. which of course hugely fights against climate change. And we were coming from the Congo Three Basins Conference Summit last year, and all that was said, and then that on forest management still held in the Congo.
Yes.
How do you explain to me that this important part of the ecosystem does not have recognized entities which have access to the Green Climate Fund?
I'll give you, well, there's a pull and push effect. In order to push money in a country, you have to be able to pull it. So that's what I was saying, that we are in a region which doesn't have accredited entities to the Green Climate Fund. I won't name countries. There's a country in North Africa which has 4 accredited entities. 4.
Which is?
It's not important, but it's an African country. That is the point.
It's not equally a crime to name.
The point is, you know, it's to avoid distraction.
Okay.
The point is, what I want to say is that there are African countries who have 4 entities. There are African countries who have 2 entities. The fact that you have a whole African region which doesn't have 1 entity, one must self-interrogate. So, and that was the point. I actually made that point in the board. I've followed very closely the work that President Sassou has done in the Congo Basin. It's extraordinary. The level of advocacy that he's doing is him and President Tshisekedi, they've been champions in advocating and making a case for strong support. Now, what they need, what needs to be then followed up by the institutions, by the national institutions, is to be ready to mobilize the expertise to be able to have institutions which can be accredited, which can mobilize. You know, mobilizing finance is a full-time job. It's a full-time job. It's a dedicated expertise. It's like an investment banker if you are in private sector. So in private sector, you have all kinds of bankers. You have bankers who do mergers and acquisition, bankers who will take your hand and take you to the financial market and issue bonds for you and mobilize resources. It's the same thing for climate finance. And it's not even that those institutions don't exist. They do exist. We have to do a better job of mobilizing them. And this has been, and that's also the very first reason why I wanted to have this region and Yaoundé to be the first destination. Because we need, this region is contributing the most to climate change, and unfortunately it's not receiving an adequate share. So what you are telling me is that critically the ecological diplomacy of the countries of the Congo Basin is not possibly effective, right? No, the diplomacy is effective. Meaning, again, I was talking push and pull. So from a diplomatic point of view, the president, the ministers are doing an extremely good job of advocating the case. It's a financial articulation. It's a financial articulation working with an ecosystem. I'll give you an example. I like giving example because it's so concrete,
absolutely,
right?
It's concrete.
We are in Yaoundé. We have the central bank of the region, right?
We have for 6 countries.
Exactly, and you have the development bank
of Central
African State.
BDRC.
They're not accredited yet. We need to have them accredited. Because if BDRC is accredited, they will be able to mobilize for the region, but we don't have them as an accredited entity. In the moment the interview will be coming to an end, let me tap on your wealth of experience, plus 12 years, working in the climate sector, rallying resources, mobilizing ideas, analyzing them. Of all the years, and I'm sure that you started when you were quite young in this field, technically. Yes, I had a lot more hair. What have you learned about the way we manage the environment in which we live? The good thing is that we have a lukewarm attitude. Well, the first thing I've seen, across the continent is progress. When I started in 2009, that was my very first COP. Climate was very much elitist, very much elitist. I'll give you a marker. in 2009, that was the creation also at the African Union level, a committee of African heads of states on climate change, led by the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. But again,
of Ethiopia.
And he was then, in 2009, the only country which had developed a program to integrate climate change in national development planning processes. He was the only one. You would only wait in 2015 to have the world picking up. But my point is, so that progress, but I've seen, first of all, progress. Right now, at every year, African heads of states meet, and there is a decision on climate change. It's hard now. I mean, now, even in the media. So I've seen that one. I've seen now progress. Climate has been, the sensitization and information, good. But the second point is, really, the challenge has been, how do you integrate climate in your development planning processes? Climate, I like to say that climate is not environment, but climate is a development issue. But climate is a national security issue. And the biggest gap now has been the creation of those instruments and tools, whether policy tools, statistic tools, let alone finance tools, that needs to be developed and really brought to policymakers, government, let alone private sector, to be able to work. That is where a lot of work needs to happen. So there's differentiation now in countries. You have countries on the continent who are champions, who are world champions when it comes to energy policy or climate, renewable energy policy, when it comes to adaptation policy, when it comes to climate finance policy. So what we want to do, both at the Green Climate Fund level and at the Africa Adaptation Initiative level, is to create those toolboxes with dedicated expertise and bring them to countries so that a country can say, okay, I have the expertise, I have the tools, I can get the job done. This is really our challenge for the next few years.
Finally, there are so many elements involved in the climate change discourse. You can talk about the renewable energy segment, you can talk about money, financing, you can talk about crafting the ideas, you can talk about the impacts. But when I look at Africa in particular, the entire discourse and focus mostly is on adaptation. Why do you think that in Africa adaptation is critical and important?
For a very specific reason. Adaptation is a necessity. Adaptation, meaning adaptation to the impacts of climate change, is a necessity. When there is a flood, governments don't have a choice. You need to deal with that flood. When there's a drought, you don't have a choice. You need to deal with that drought. When there's any extreme weather event, so adaptation is something, an impact. This impact is imposed on us first. Second, with climate change going really wild, because emissions are not coming down, are not slowing down 2% per year, but are actually increasing 2% per year, we're having still an increase and an intensity in climate change. And as I said, if you look at our government, if you look at our development trajectory, the fact that most of our development is still linked to natural resources, which is going to be hit by climate change, this is a necessity. So adapting to climate change, integrating adaptation and climate impacts in all of our policy, in our agriculture policy, in our water policy, in our land policy, is just good common sense development. Now, reducing emission, though, is an opportunity. Reducing emission, as a country, if you take the energy sector, it can allow you to have access to technology, to have access to cleaner technology. A country like Cameroon can have a very good mix of hydro and solar and batteries to be able to have maybe even 100% a mix, so that oil and gas can be exported for foreign income. Both Ethiopia and Kenya, I said I was not going to name names, but this, this is the end. They're almost at 100% of renewable energy in their mix. So reducing emission, to put it mildly, we like to say that reducing emission is an opportunity. Okay. Accessing finance, accessing capacity, accessing technology. But adapting to an impact. If you're told as the head of the government that tomorrow there's going to be, but your capital city is going to be flooded, you need to deal with that. And unfortunately, that is going to take resources that you had planned. That is how vicious climate change is. Not only it is eroding development gains, but it can take away resources that you had programmed for other priorities, but you'll need to deal with the urgency. Because when you have a city which is flooded, this is your emergency. So you need to deal with that. It's a necessity. That's the thing with adaptation. It is a necessity.
On the need of climate change as an emergency, we end the interview. The co-chair of the Green Climate Fund, Malian-born Seyni Nafo, thank you very much indeed for being guest on my program.
Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome.
Thank you.